Then they wrap it in burlap, load it in that wire basket, and ship it out. For a typical street tree size tree, that's 600 to 700 pounds altogether. The advantage of that is that once you've got that in the ground and dig that hole, it's really like an anchor, and it locks the tree in the ground so that it's much more resistant to people leaning on it or forces against it. The downside, of course, is that they're big and hard to plant. Now, when they dig these trees out of the ground, the tree will lose 50 plus, maybe as much as 75 or 80% of its root system. So the tree's ability to absorb water has been reduced by 50 to 75%. So that's a really critical part for our newly planted trees. And because we plant trees in the spring and in the fall. So especially those spring planted trees, they've only got a little bit of time to regrow those new roots and try to get them in as much soil as possible before the heat of the summer and there's a really big spike in water demand. So I included this photo just so I hope everyone appreciates your municipal foresters and urban tree planters and everything, because yep, that's what a truckload of trees look like. And it's like, wait, where is that one oak that's on the plans to go in this particular hole? And you have to dig through the truck. If you're really smart and you have a good planting plan, you loaded the trees on the truck in the reverse order that you needed them. Of course, that's assuming that everything in life goes perfectly all the time. The planting plans never get swapped around, or you have to start at the other end because of some other problem. But just a reminder of the effort that goes into planting urban trees. So this is the tree as it would be planted in the ground, almost completed. Normally, at least certainly all the rope up top and at least the top of that wire basket and the burlap would be removed. My personal preference is to see all of it gone, but it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of difference if, like, just say the bottom half of the basket is left in the ground. There's been less research on this than you might think, but the little bit of research that there is seems to suggest it's not a huge deal to leave it. So when we're thinking about watering trees, especially our newly planted ones, that root ball is all the roots that the tree has. Now it'll grow some roots outside of that area, but that's where the roots are. So when we water our urban trees, this is how we do it, or at least Trees New York does it. We form a ring of soil around the tree, usually about a total of about 3 feet across, because that's kind of the standard size of those root balls in the nursery. And then you're watering into the center of that ring so that the water sits there and then soaks right down into the root ball, and that way you're getting the water to where the tree's roots are. Especially here in New York City, the Parks Department has been cutting tree beds larger and larger, and their preference is at this point for 5 by 10 tree beds. So there's a lot of surface area there that you could water, but there's no roots there, so it's not doing any real good. So this is the preferred method to water, is just right over the root ball like this, and that way you know that the tree's roots are getting watered. How much water? What we usually say, if it hasn't rained that week, you'd be looking at like 10 to 15 gallons once a week, possibly twice a week if it's real hot. Right near me here in Manhattan last summer, we had a bunch of new trees planted. Then we had a long, hot, dry period in the summer. And I didn't have the ability to move that much water to the new trees, but I was trying in one shot, but I was trying to do like 3 to 4 gallons, which I had a couple of 3 and 4 gallon camping water containers, which I could do every day. It's usually better to water more at once, but hey, any water is better than none if it's the difference between survival or the tree dying. And as far as I know, everything I watered got through the summer, not necessarily in great condition, but at least still alive. Oops. Sorry, skipping ahead there. So one of the major tree problems that we encounter, I suspect you'll have it too if you see it, or as your group gets started up and everything, something to watch out for is raised mulch or soil around the tree. Because what that does is that holds moisture against the trunk of the tree, and that creates perfect conditions for decay to get into the trees. So this is something we want to absolutely avoid. If it's something that can be written now that you're working with the forester, if it's something that can be written into the city's forestry standards or rules or regulations around it, that would be an excellent thing too. Doing this is very popular, especially among buildings that contract out their landscaping and have plantings like this, because they'll raise the soil, fill in that raised area with, usually it's actually soilless mix like you'd buy from the hardware store for containers, and then plant into that because it's easier than planting into the real soil. But as you can see on the trunk of this tree, that's all fungus, and this tree, which is otherwise didn't have any problems, this is probably a takedown because of that level of decay and weakening the tree and making it more of a risk to break in storms. So that's where, it's not raising that soil and that mulch. And also a big part of this is public education too. So just spreading the word as much as you can, and stopping people from doing this, particularly targeting things like co-op or condo associations, building supers, anybody who might have some kind of control over those situations. The other reason not to raise soil in tree beds is that trees are very adaptive plants. And if you raise that soil, there's a good chance the tree will start to grow new roots from its trunk into that surrounding soil. For some trees, especially things like honey locusts, doing this results in these high roots, typically right under the in this raised soil or right under the sidewalk. Once they get into that raised soil, they'll follow the edge of whatever the container is, or the wall, in this case a wall that was built around them, and they'll go just under the sidewalk, and then as soon as they start to grow, they lift the sidewalk and they break the sidewalk. So another good reason to avoid raising that soil. Sometimes nothing really bad happens, and then whatever the problem is gets removed, and you wind up with this, the block O roots that nobody quite knows what to do with, or should you even get rid of it. And I know I'm sort of going on and on about raised soil here, but they cause one other problem, which is those raised roots can start to circle the trunk of the tree. And as they get bigger and get older, the roots can actually choke the tree itself. It'll choke itself on its own root system. It's called girdling roots. When it's actually choking the tree, it's called girdling roots. If they're just circling and not choking the tree yet, it's called circling roots. So the big root on the left side of the tree here, where you can see it's already in contact with the trunk, that is girdling. The big root on the right side that's almost but not quite there is circling. Moving on, there's tree guards. I saw some things in your material that suggests that these are permissible there. You have to be careful about the design of tree guards, though. There's all kinds of crazy things that get planted as tree guards done. This is the current New York City Parks Department standard. Some people have objections to it, especially that open side on the street side. Some people have objections if you close the street side. You'll never satisfy everyone. The main things that the Parks Department looks for, which I think are good standards for tree guards, is they want something that is about 18 inches tall, plus or minus. So think knee height, just so it's relatively visible and not too easy to trip over, especially for people who may have poor vision or if it's dark out, things like that. There was a trend here in New York City. It's happily, I think, hope, mostly gone away. To do like a polished granite edge just a couple inches high all around the tree beds. And usually it was a granite color that was fairly close to concrete. So it could be very hard if you were impaired or it was at night, and again for people to trip over them. The next Parks Department is no points or projections that could unreasonably injure somebody if they fell on them. This is something we have seen a decent amount of here in the city, especially with spikes on tree guards that were designed to prevent people from sitting on them. Because some buildings were rumbly, they didn't like people sitting on the tree guards in front of their buildings. If you look at the top set of hoops on this, you'll notice how thin that bar is. So it's designed to be uncomfortable to sit without having any points stick out that would be really dangerous. The next requirement is open sides to the tree guard for 2 reasons. The first, to make it at least theoretically a tiny little bit harder to pile mulch or soil in the tree bed and raise the soil level. The other reason is so that any runoff water from the sidewalk, like a rainstorm, can actually get into the tree bed, so that the tree bed's absorbing water, you're not getting it going into the sewer system and having combined sewage overflows, if you're familiar with what that is. And so that the tree can actually get water from the surrounding sidewalk during a rainstorm. So I say slightly worse tree guard, and that is only because it has that fourth side by the street. In New York City, that always caused a lot of fights with drivers and car owners because it made it very hard or almost impossible to open the passenger side door. And it also made it harder for the Parks Department to do maintenance. And as a result, the Parks Department's maintenance crews also asked that the fourth side be removed. So that's how we wound up with that new standard of 3 sides, not 4. On this tree, you can also see it's got all those fresh cut pine branches. Those are actually leftovers from people's Christmas trees that have been sort of dumped there, put there as, I shouldn't say dumped, that makes it sound like we don't want it, put there for the trees, need to the organic matter over the soil surface, and that is an excellent thing and something we recommend. The one thing to keep in mind about most of the stuff that would be Christmas trees, months down the line, like typically 5, 6 months after it goes down, the green obviously fades, but then it will start to turn orange when the needles will start to turn orange when they get really old, which people, I guess, object to. So continuing on that, before we mulch, if you're out cultivating, if you're out caring for your trees, the next thing would be cultivation. And cultivation is just breaking up that heavy packed soil that we tend to have in the city and tree beds where people are stepping on it a lot. And by cultivating soil, we break up that compacted soil and it helps water and oxygen to get down to the tree's roots. The tree's roots need oxygen. The tree's leaves need carbon dioxide. So now we improve the soil, we increase the amount of water that'll go down to the tree's roots. And then once the soil is cultivated and we form that ring around our newly planted tree of soil, then mulch, like you see in the left side picture here, right over the top of everything. And ideally mulches organic matter. There are people who use things like river rock or small kind of like white landscaping stones. The downside of those is they don't break down. So there's no new organic matter, no new soil carbon, if you would, being added back to the soil. And the other problem with those is that they tend to trap a lot of litter in the stones. When we mulch, we want to mulch our tree 2 to 3 inches deep. And you can right over where that central ring tree is. It wasn't done in this case, but it certainly can be. Mulching will, again, help hold moisture in the soil. The mulch will break down and add nutrients back to the soil. So mulch is a great practice. I realize in the city, in urban areas, it can be challenging. And we have typically found, you saw, I think in the previous year, that we had larger wood chips, pieces of wood chips that were known as mulch. They're smaller in this one. Larger chips tend to stay down and stay in place a lot better. Smaller chips like this one are typically so small that they wind up blowing or washing away very, very easily. There we are. Sorry about that. And another source of common urban tree damage we see is bikes getting chained or locked to trees. Both direct damage from the chain itself and also the problem of the pedals, chains, things like that, hitting and damaging the trees. Cracks or even tree guards are usually a good solution to this, because at least in my experience, I found that most people will not lock or chain their bike to the tree if there is a better option, like a bike rack, purpose-built bike rack, even a tree guard. One other problem we have had with small trees and stations like that is people who have chained their bikes to especially smaller newly planted trees, and especially some of the blocks like the one you hear in the chains are versus tree. Trees were being cut in half so the block and the bike could be lifted off in piece and stolen. So moving to planting in our tree beds. So there's lots of options of things to plant. Urban tree beds generally are just a tough place to try and grow anything. The top layer of soil is typically very dry. They often wind up with a lot of foot traffic. They can wind up with a lot of litter. They can wind up with a lot of dog urine, dog waste on them. So it can be challenging when planting. And you have to sort of resist the temptation to get too emotionally attached to the plants, or planting anything in the that's like really expensive or is going to be very upsetting if it gets damaged, or in some cases also, because it's happened to me, yes, stolen. Another thing to think about when you're planting is, what do you want that space or those plantings to do? And the concept of that we think of at Trees New York as sort of pickables versus non-pickables. So anything that has single big showy flowers on a stem, like on the left you see here, is pickables, and that's going to be able to pick them, even though they probably know better that they shouldn't. Small flowers and in complex groups on a lot of stems, like you see on the right here, tends to discourage picking. It's not 100%, usually helps. So if you're going to be gardening and planting in tree beds, the first thing you have to do is consider the conditions, and it's how much sun does the get. Factor in the surrounding buildings, and don't forget the canopy of the tree itself, the leaves and the branches that are going to probably going to shade that tree bed for some or all of the day. You may find a site that looks like you'd think it would be full and is maybe getting only half. The soil and about the amount of foot traffic at the site, especially if it's an area that tends to get more foot traffic. You typically want taller plants, because those will tend to discourage people from walking through stuff. Again, when you get to about mid-shin height, that tends to prevent people from walking through your tree beds and damaging the trees, or excuse me, damaging the plants. How much wind does the site get? You can have situations or conditions where you can have very strong, consistent drying wind that adds to that dry soil problem. Any other conditions you can see out there that might impact growing. So for the bike lane that's shown here, and this is a little pedestrian island that separates the bike lane from the rest of traffic, the conditions are dry, and it's actually part shade because it gets sun during the morning in the middle of the day. So thinking about our native planting, and especially because I know there's a lot of people out there now who want to look at planting to support pollinators or other wildlife. So some ideas of how you can be caring for your tree bed plantings in a way that supports them. So the first is limited or no cultivation, and typically this is best achieved by sort of designating an area or a particular tree bed where you're going to do this, and mostly keeping mulch down at that point. Leaving some of that soil unmulched, space for ground nesting bees to actually nest. In the case of at least New York State, and I suspect New Jersey, 54% of our native bees are actually solitary and ground nesting. So those are the kind of spaces that they're for. When thinking about your planting design, try to think about having something in the bed that's flowering for as much of the year as possible, so that any bees or other native insects or any other insects that find the flowers, they have a chance of getting something from that bed throughout the whole season, not just for a couple of weeks. Choosing native species and the so-called straight species, which is the species you would find it in the wild when possible, and trying to avoid double flowers. So on the right side here, on the top right, that's echinacea, or coneflower, and that's the straight species as you would see it. And then below that, with that big round super tufted top to it, that is one of the doubled flowers. That's a particular cultivar. The problem with those doubled flowers is all the extra petals can make it very difficult or impossible for pollinators to actually get to the nectar and pollen in the plant that they're looking for. Finally, part of these native insects, or the advantage of them, is they need these plants not just for pollen and their nectar, but also for food, eating the leaves or the stems or the potential flowers of the plant itself, and in some cases for nesting materials like leaf cutter bees cutting pieces of leaves off and using them to line their nests. So you have to recognize that one of the best ways to support these pollinators is that some plant damage is going to be part of that. So a couple of things that have worked, or that I've seen have worked for other people as tree bed plants. This is not a 100% exclusive list. Some of the things that people have sworn to me are great tree bed plants and I've tried to grow, I've had no luck at, and then some things that maybe didn't seem like they would be good tree bed plants have worked reasonably well. So I'll start with bearded irises. You saw them growing in flower in that one slide with the bike lane tree bed. They come in lots of different colors and lots of different sizes. Not native, unfortunately, but surprisingly tough. And grow in some really tough situations like you saw there and do pretty well. They look much more delicate than they actually are. Getting onto the natives, we have Solomon's Plume. This is a one for woodland areas. So this was like a more part to full shade plant. If you've got a spot or a tree bed that you know is moist, maybe the block just kind of tends to drain that direction. This is a good choice for a native plant. You can see in the flowers on the left, it's not real showy. It's more grown for the fruit, like you see on the right. Somewhat similar, closely related species is Starry Solomon's Plume, and this is again, this is more a foliage plant than anything else, but good for medium to dry soil. I have seen people, at least a few people, be able to grow these in New York City tree beds. Wild geranium, not the garden one with the typically like maroon or red flowers that you see like at Home Depot and places like that. But this is the perennial one here. To be honest, I have not had great success with this in tree beds, and I've tried a couple of times, but I know people who tell me that they've had. So again, it's one of those super specific, one tree bed may have very different conditions than another. And Agustaki Funiculum, sorry, botanical name there, or anise hyssop, and this has been a super reliable plant in all kinds of really tough sunny, dry situations for us. This one's at least part sun, and bees and pollinators just absolutely adore it. This has been really reliable for us. It's one of the first things I would recommend if you had a tough site with a lot of sun. And with that, of course, there's also bulbs for tree beds. As you can see here, this was my little experiment. It's the same tree bed as the flat where we started talking about the planting. For anything beds, you notice that had a tree guard. Any kind of plantings in a tree bed, tree guards are super helpful and important. I almost at this point wouldn't try planting a tree bed that didn't have one. Just things get so trampled. In bulbs, probably the thing we most reliable success with has been daffodils, followed by hyacinth. tulips a little more dicey as bulbs go, and everything else we had mixed success with. All right, well, that's my slides, so I will stop share.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sam. I'm gonna unmute folks' video. Folks can unmute their own video if they'd like to. I muted everyone just to keep the connection strong so we can all hear Sam. But thank you so much. I feel like I've got a long list of flowers that I need to go out and buy imminently.
That's where the temptation begins.
So it looks like I can't actually start anybody's videos, but maybe Sam, you can go for it. We were recording this whole webinar, and I think that we may. I've been taking some notes that I may end up kind of consolidating into a helpful list that we can certainly circulate as well. But I'm really curious to hear if there's any kind of questions from folks who've been watching. Feel free to unmute yourself, ask away.
Yeah, I have a question. Sam, these flowers that you speak of, planting in the beds and so forth, is there any budget in the New York City budget for those flowers? Or is that strictly all money spent by volunteers or neighborhood associations?
That is an excellent question. There's no money in, well, I shouldn't say that. There is no fixed budget in the New York City Parks Department for tree bed plantings. They have been cases where they're doing like testing native projects or plants and things like that. And in those, they will get funding for it, but that's rare. The standard is that it's planted by somebody or some group in the neighborhood paying for it.
Okay. And then I was quite surprised. I knew that, you know, young trees need a lot of water, but wow, 10 to 15 gallons a week. I mean, Dan, my question, I mean, Jersey City, I just don't see that happening. Them going around and watering trees. I just lived down the street from Riverview Park where they redid the park, planted. I mean, those trees sat out there all summer, Baltimore wept. I would imagine that they were watered, I suppose, but then they were put in the fall. Maybe you don't have to water in the fall. I don't know, but I do know that they have to guarantee trees. My fear is that a lot of those trees may not make it. Okay. And I would think that, and I know because I actually worked for Parks Department back in the 80s. So I was actually at a job in Central Park overseeing the planting there. And why am I bringing this up? Because I just know that it requires water and they would have to come with a water truck and so forth. Dan, it's just a concern of mine. Do you ever see them watering young trees or?
Yeah, I've definitely seen some watering initiatives and stuff from the forester and co. But to answer your question, Camille, and both your questions to some extent, I think Sustainable Jersey City is definitely invested in kind of, obviously we're a nonprofit as well, but finding some of the funds for some of this tree bed maintenance, and the funds that would be required for moving a lot of water, which obviously ain't cheap either. But yeah, I think you're right that it's a lot of water, and finding a way to kind of get that out there is something that we'll need to consider. I'd be curious. Sam, is the solution just to strap everybody with a bunch of water bottles, or how do you guys manage those watering initiatives?
Yeah, when we start watering in the summer, I call it Operation No Neck, because it's 2 5-gallon buckets, and you do that all summer, and by the end of the summer, it's just a straight slope from your ear to your shoulders. The Parks Department partnered with the Department of Environmental Protection in New York City, and because the Department of Environmental Protection controls our fire hydrants. Every year for a group, they don't do it for individuals, but they do it for established groups. They get a hydrant permit that allows you to open hydrants, with certain restrictions on them and certain rules, to enable people to water that way. In New York City, the tree planting companies, it's the same thing. There's a guarantee, and Parks Department actually now has a scannable tag on trees that the companies have to go to scan to prove that we're at least there and theoretically we're watering too. I have seen the planting companies do it, the planting contractors. Most people don't because it's so fast. Like I was actually in our truck waiting for a group of students, amusingly, to water trees, and the planting contractor pulled up in a pickup truck right next to mine with a big tank on the back. And it was just sort of one, fill the bucket, dump it, fill the bucket, dump it, scan the tags, and moved on, and was there for like maybe 3 minutes. But the trees did get watered.
Incredible.
The other option, if you've got someone who's got it, the best solution we've found in terms of moving bigger volumes of water is if you can find someone who's got a hose. We got a 100-gallon collapsible tank. It sort of looks like a water bed for the back of our company pickup. And that has worked better than I would have hoped.
Noted. All right.
And,
I will start
once it's empty,
for water
it's
and also in my my next door app, I've been seeing people say, oh, they planted the tree I requested in Jersey City. How do I take care of it? And I have said to them, water when as soon as it starts to get warm, you've got to water it. And again, this goes back to our stewardship idea, Dan, in Jersey City, to educate people that if they have a new tree near them and so forth, that it needs water for it to survive during dry spells. Now, if we got a lot of rain, that wouldn't be an issue. But also, obviously people aren't aware of what a new tree needs to survive, and water being the most important, obviously, and not putting bikes up against it. And these are young trees, and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, I'm trying to get the word out on next door, because several people, were really happy they got their cherry tree. And in fact, we just had I think it's a scarlet oak planted right next door to me. I'll be making sure that gets water. I thankfully have a hose, so that won't be a problem. And
I'm glad to hear it, Camille, and I appreciate you getting the word out. I want to make sure other folks have a chance to ask questions too, because I know that.
Sure.
But does anybody else on the call have any other big picture questions about how they can do exactly what Camille was just saying? Right, you have trees in your neighborhood that you're not sure how to take care of. Any big questions that weren't answered already by Sam's presentation? No, nobody. I've got a question that relates to our tree mapping that might help. But if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to interrupt or throw them in the chat. Sam, you pointed out a lot of bad planting practices and kind of the unfortunate side effects of those. Either the block of roots or the girdling or any of that stuff. And I know that in a lot of cases, once that's really manifesting, it's kind of already too late to take big action, because that's just the way the tree has grown. And correct me if I'm wrong on that. How do we know, both in our tree census that we're doing and in our kind of stewardship, like how do we know when a tree is particularly unhealthy? What constitutes an unhealthy tree? If we're walking down the street and we see something, what's the difference between a tree that's just under the usual stresses of urban life or a tree that like needs some intervention ASAP?
Trust your instincts. Unhealthy look really unhealthy. A couple of early warning signs. When you look up at the top of the tree, instead of seeing leaves all the way to the ends of the branches, you're seeing bare dead branches up there. And one or two is usually okay, but if it seems to be a pretty normal thing across the top of the tree. especially during the summer. This next one is a little bit tricky because some trees do this naturally, and some almost won't do it until they're effectively dead. But if you're seeing the edges of the leaf go brown, that at least should be a little bit of a flag that the leaves aren't getting enough water. And then finally, the other one is if you're seeing a lot of what we call water sprouts or epicormic sprouts on the trunk of the tree, which will look like little branches coming from the trunk of the tree. So instead of following the usual pattern of it's a tree's trunk and then it goes to big branches and smaller branches and smaller branches, from the bigger branches in the trunk, you'll just have lots of little coming up from the tree. That is another usual sign of a tree that's under a lot of stress.
Got it. Super helpful. I'm going to gamble from the lack of convo in the chat and lack of folks unmuting themselves that there are no other big picture questions. So I'd love to kind of throw over to, well, first, a round of virtual applause for Sam. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. It's so great to connect.
Yes, it was very good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.
I was going to ask, would it be helpful for people to get a PDF of the slides?
If you don't mind sending, I was going to say that would be great.
Yeah. And
Sure.
I just want to
No
say
problem.
one more thing if I could. I know I talk a lot, but I just, I want to get everything down. Well, okay, for example, there was a time, Dan, Jersey City planted or put tree grates around the trees, which compacts the soil. And Sam, you mentioned about how you have to go around and dig and make the soil friable. I think that's the right word, so that it can absorb water, which is important. And I don't believe they use those tree grates anymore because that was a big mistake. You know what I'm talking about, Dan? With the spokes, the tree grates, they have
large metal tree grates. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think they even
New York City did the same thing.
Yeah, and they don't do that anymore, correct? I mean, they kept the weeds down, but I'm sure it limited the amount of water that was available for the root system. Right? Sam, they don't do that anymore in New York, right?
Yeah, no, and I sorry, I don't remember from the materials if Dan sent me. I suspect they do it only very rarely or don't at all because it causes so many problems.
Yeah, it's not, there's quite a few of them. Whenever they last made a bunch of tree beds in downtown, there's a lot of steel grates there, but yeah, they don't do it anymore because of all the problems, the compacting, everything else. Yeah, and a lot of the grates have been removed, honestly, as well.
Well, that's good.
Yeah. But would you say, Sam, that the kind of three-sided, I mean, it's the standard that the Parks Department in New York is using right now, is that the ideal tree guard that we should be pushing for as well?
I think if you're going to go with the proposal, I think that's, like to the powers that be, I think that's the one to go with. Anything that interferes with car doors has tended to draw a lot of resistance. And that's in New York City where people owning a car is not that big a thing. I think it just saves a step if you start with the three-sided as start with the four-sided, figure